name is Suzanne. I am the Child Advocacy Program Manager at the Cindy Network, otherwise known as the Children in Distress Network, and we're based in Pietermaritzburg. And it's our great pleasure to host you here today for this virtual panel discussion on strengthening responses to boys affected by sexual abuse. Just a little overview of what we have planned for this morning whilst people are still joining. I'll do a brief introduction to the background to this panel discussion, which is based on some research that we carried out with Childline South Africa and Family for Every Child. And then each of the four panelists will do a brief presentation. I will introduce them before they start. And then we'll hopefully have some time at the end for question and answers from the participants, you, the audience. And some time for engagement and discussion around the issues that have been presented. And then we will be closing up and wrapping up the meeting by 12 o'clock today. So thank you once again for joining us. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And also once the presenters start presenting, please also feel free to add your questions as they go along in the chat box. We will have chance at the end for people to ask their questions directly. Everybody has the functionality to turn on their video and to unmute themselves. So you will be able to also ask in person virtually. But during the presentations, please can I just ask everybody to keep their microphones muted and their videos off. We are expecting quite a large number of people, so it just helps with the bandwidth for those who are not on stable connections. So just an overview of the research that we did in South Africa, very brief. We have done a bigger presentation of this, which is available online, and I will share about that later. The main research questions that we were exploring related to masculinity and sexuality, and how these affect the way in which boys are vulnerable to or exposed to sexual violence. We looked at the links between dominant notions of masculinity and sexuality and sexual violence. And we also looked at what interventions are currently available for boys who are both actors in terms of inappropriate sexual behavior or victims of sexual violence. And some of the protective factors that were identified, I thought this was a useful context to provide. We looked at protective and risk factors. And it's basically based on these that we've asked the panelists to come and join us today to try and highlight some of their work or some of the areas that could be strengthened around these risk and protective factors. So in terms of protective factors identified through the research, and the research was carried out with boys who were victims or actors in sexual violence, their caregivers, as well as boys and girls and caregivers from the general population. And here's what they told us they saw as protective factors. So parental knowledge about sexual violence, understanding what this is, how children are affected and how to keep them safe, obviously was a key protective factor. Responsive parent-child relationships were also a key protective factor. Life skills programs at school, particularly in the sections which address appropriate sexual behavior, relationship issues, emotional health and well-being, the involvement of fathers, and I know Vessa will be touching on the issue of social fathers later on, and then also responsive community-based support for boys affected by sexual violence and their families. In terms of risk factors, some of the key ones that we noted were the lack of parental or little to parental supervision of television and online use. Also, cultures which strongly enforce respect and obedience to elders. This is, obviously we all want our children to be respectful, but when this is enforced to the extent that children don't have a say or an opinion, it can place them in a position that makes them vulnerable to violence. High levels of violence in general was considered a risk factor. This next one's a very interesting one, the greater freedom given to boys. In fact, one of the boys expressed how he found this freedom that he was given because he was a boy to make him feel less loved and less valued and cared for than his female siblings, for example. And so this focus on girls as only vulnerable denies boys an adequate response. So we think that girls need protection, but the boys don't, because by the very nature of being masculine, they don't require protection. There was little understanding of grooming and non-contact sexual abuse, and these behaviors were not always recognized as abusive when they were recognized. And this is particularly interesting in relation to boys, because there is quite a strong body of evidence that suggests that boys are more vulnerable to non-contact sexual abuse than girls. And then also the challenges of focusing only on the physical outcomes of abuse, and rather than looking at the mental and emotional health outcomes. So I'm now going to hand over to our panelists, and I will introduce them first. The first panelist is Dr. Shahida Omar. She's from the Teddy Bear Clinic for Abused Children. She has been there since 2000. And during this time, she has developed the professional standards of services offered by the clinic. She's well known and respected in the field of child abuse, and she's driven the diversion program for young sex offenders since its inception, and continues to take the program from strength to strength. She completed her PhD and graduated in June 2011, and her work in this level of studies adds to the literature and greater understanding of child abuse in South Africa, and the diversion program in particular. Our next panelist is Dr. Wessel van den Berg. He's the father of 2 young children and works as the Research, Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Unit Manager at Sonke Gender Justice. Key projects that he has contributed to include the Men Care Global Fatherhood Campaign, the State of South Africa's Fathers Report series, advocacy for the prohibition of corporal punishment in all settings, and the promotion of gender equal parental leave. He has worked as a kindergarten teacher, counselor, researcher, and activist, and his doctoral study was about the engagement of South African men in a feminist ethic of care. Next panelist is Nonhle Nteta from Childline South Africa. She's a qualified social worker with a Bachelor of Social Work and a certificate in project management. She's currently a program manager at Childline South Africa, and in this role, she provides therapeutic counseling to boys who present inappropriate sexual behavior, coordinates child protection programs for victims of sexual violence for both boys and girls, and facilitates accredited CPD training to diverse professionals within the child protection system for capacity building. And our last panelist is Linda Smallbones. She's a social worker and play therapy practitioner. She has been a social worker for over 22 years and working in diverse fields such as community work, therapeutic work, and child protection work. And this has led to her passion of working with people's emotional health, especially as it pertains to healthy relationships and parenting. She has a special interest in attachment and trauma and how they impact on the parenting role and relationships. A key focus of her work is on strengthening relationships between children, the children she sees and their parents, and play and joy are key components that she loves to cultivate as they grow relationships and help to protect resilience and flourishing. So I would now like to hand over to Shahida. I'm going to switch off my video and allow her to take over.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you for this great opportunity, and I would just like to once again express my gratitude to Cindy and the team that made this possible. I think a very much needed topic, something that we haven't addressed, and in all our meetings we are finding that boys have actually become invisible. Their needs have not been addressed, and we're actually ignoring something that is a glaring omission if we want to disrupt the cycle of sexual abuse. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Looking at the relationship between domestic violence and violence against boys, now this is an important relationship that we need to focus, because often we find that children who may not have been sexually abused can go on to become sexual abusers. However, children who have come from environments of domestic violence, we have actually found on the ground from clinical evidence that there's actually a link between the two, between domestic violence and child sexual abuse. And the reality is that it's both girls and boys. Not one gender is excluded from this scourge of violence. And even if the children are not the intended targets of violence in this domestic relationship, they are exposed to it and of course are affected in the same way as those who are physically and sexually abused. So, being exposed is as traumatic and could certainly have lifelong implications, as Cindy, Suzanne indicated, that the emotional and the mental conditions and impact that it would leave on children. But we also need to appreciate that domestic violence is not a single event. It's a pattern of behavior which increases in severity, frequency, and often resulting in victimization of both boys and girls. And we have experienced and seen episodes of domestic violence, which includes the attack on boys and girls. And I will speak to 3 case studies which will briefly illustrate the challenges and trauma that children are faced with in domestic relationships. Now, the overlap, if we look at domestic violence and child physical or sexual abuse, we have found it ranges from 30 to 50%. And having worked at shelters, we work closely with the shelter here in Braamfontein, and a lot of the women at the shelters have actually confirmed this, that their children have been both victims of physical and sexual abuse, and including the boys. But the shelters that we've worked with, they are only shelters that accommodate female children and for a stipulated period. Boy children above the age of 10 are not actually allowed into the shelter. So it's quite restrictive, least empowering and most restrictive. Next slide, please. Now I want to look at males and sexual assault, because if we look at the research, 10 to 20% of all males will experience some form of sexual abuse at some stage in their lives. And I think this is also confirmed by the Optimus study, which was conducted by the Center for Justice and Crime Prevention from UCT. But the reality is that male sexual assault has been shrouded in secrecy, and there's a stigma, an element of stigma, but also if we look at the role that culture, the invulnerability and denial of pain are seen as essential qualities of macho and being masculine. So, this certainly prevents male victims from coming forward. They're not in a position to admit that they've been sexually abused and assaulted because of the kind of responses and the reception that has been received, and the kind of behavior that it would elicit from people that they share this information with. And we know that if we look around at services and programs that are being provided, there's actually a lack of recovery services and support, tailored specifically for your boy child or boy victim of sexual abuse. If we just look at the notion of sexual abuse, the first image that would come to one's mind is that of a girl. So it's always the services focusing on the needs of girls as victims, not seeing boys as victims. And often boys are seen as the victimizers, not the victims. And in my experiences, our experiences, I think a lot of you can actually also verify that when cases of male sexual abuse and boy children particularly are referred to law enforcement, to the police, to justice systems, even to government departments like DSD, they're not equipped to deal with sexual abuse of males. How do you actually address that? How, in their minds, they're actually trying to figure out how can a boy be abused, because that is not something that exists in their vocabulary or even in their skills base. So, we know that many people are not actually equipped and realize that large numbers of males are sexually abused. Male victims become a forgotten category. And I think that is something that we need to be aware of. I think the screen, the slides have gone off, Philippe. If we can just flight it on again so people can see, please. Thank you. So, and we need to realize that males have become invisible, they're hidden, and there's denial, even not only on the part of society or people around them, but denial by the individual. They actually disown the fact that they've been abused because of the responses that are elicited, and of course, because of the way they would be perceived. So we need to understand that most boys who experience sexual assault actually don't reveal or make a disclosure, even to people they trust or even they know, because of their fears that are of being disbelieved, ridiculed, shamed, accused of being weak, not being able to stand up or protect themselves, and even the issues around sexual orientation, where they would be perceived as gay. So I think it's, the reasoning explains itself because boys are afraid of being further victimized, the secondary victimization, the secondary trauma. So it would be easier to hide behind the shroud of secrecy and continue suffering rather than exposing themselves and being subjected to further trauma. And I think this is something that we need to be aware that they actually suffer in silence and continue to suffer, and often are misunderstood when they manifest behaviors that one cannot explain. When they become sexual predators, bullies, aggressive, hostile, all sorts of unexplained behaviors, that this could be as a result of their experiences. Next slide, please. So let's look at the myths and realities. Often, if we look at the myths, males cannot be sexually abused. The reality is it can happen to any boy, regardless of his size, strength, appearance, race, culture. It can happen at school, at home, where it's most likely to occur, in cars, in schools, sports grounds, in change rooms. And what usually happens is that boys usually freeze when this happens. It's not something that they're expecting. So they are totally unprepared. And often the question is, what could they not have stopped it? Could they not have done something about it? Unfortunately, it is something that they're not really prepared for. And therefore, we find that they freeze. The next myth is only gays are sexually assaulted. Now, the reality is that gay males may be targeted more frequently by anti-gay movements, but heterosexual males are sexually assaulted in large numbers, so regardless of the sexual orientation. The third myth, only gay men sexually abuse boys. Now, we know that that is not the reality. Sexual assault is more about violence and anger than lust or sexual gratification. And the vast majority of males that sexually abuse boys are not necessarily gay. Next slide. So another myth, boys who experience child sexual abuse will become abusers. Now, in reality, and in working with young sex offenders, I have to admit that in my PhD, we also found that a significant percentage, more than 70% of the children who were acting out sexually against other children were actually not victims of sexual abuse. They were actually victims of a dysfunctional family. They were victims of physical abuse and had witnessed domestic violence. So just to contextualize it, that there isn't a definite correlation. Yes, they could become sexual victimizers, but that's not necessarily the outcome always. Now, premature sexual trauma may result in emotional damage. It may perpetuate sexual violence. But just explaining that children who witness other forms of violence, who come into the crossfire of domestic conflict and disputes, could also contribute to that kind of perpetuating of sexual violence. The next myth is males can't be sexually abused by females. Now, males can be abused by males and by females. And we find that females could use different methods and means. They could use foreign objects, digital objects, sex toys. And I think often the concerns of a male child, and having talked to boys, is that they actually experienced an erection, and that's a physiological response, and their fear around being labeled as enjoying it, wanting it, and feeling guilty about it. And I think this is one of the reasons that has also stopped young boys from reporting or disclosing it. And that's something that we need to be aware of. Another myth is if a perpetrator should consider himself fortunate to enter the exciting world of sex. So I think the myth is that a boy child that has been exposed to sexualized behavior by a groomer, by another person, that they should consider that as an exciting opportunity. Now, that's a myth, because no matter who provokes it or who actually is instrumental in starting this, whether it's a teacher, childminder, a sports coach, it is all about control and domination. Premature or forced sex causes confusion. It causes anger. We've even seen children who are depressed and manifesting other psychological problems, whether it's eating disorders, outbursts, not performing at school. It is always abusive and traumatizing. And I think that's the reality we need to address, that it does impact on a child, regardless of whether it's a male or a female, and boy children suffer as much as a female child. Next slide. And I've already said that boys, the myth is that boys suffer less than girls. That is what people would like to believe. But the reality is that they suffer equally, if not more, because they are not recognized, they're not validated, and it's not expected of boys to come forward and share those kind of traumatic experiences. This just reiterates males cannot get raped. That's a myth, but we know that it happens all the time, but does not get reported regularly or consistently. And then males get labeled. That's another myth, because the reality is that anybody can be a victim of it, and that doesn't mean that they are responsible for what has happened. Next slide, please. So just looking at 3 case studies, I'm coming to the end quickly. We had a case referred from an informal settlement where there was a makeshift school. They were using containers because they had to vacate the school premises because it was unsafe for the children to remain in that school premises. And there were 40 children in a container in this classroom. 2 of the children were caught acting out on each other. And furthermore, what we found is that when those 2 children were referred to our medical clinic, on further exploration, it was discovered that all the children were acting out. They were having this massive orgy, in the toilets and in an overcrowded classroom where the educator could not even see what was happening in front of her. What on further exploration with our social workers and the multidisciplinary team, we found that there was an initiator. Now the children were in grade 8, so that's the standard 6, looking at children between the ages of 14 and 15. And there was an initiator who was identified, and he was a victim of transactional sex. So from his community where he lived, somebody was grooming him. There was an adult male grooming him and providing him with tokens and gifts, and this initiator then engaged with all the other children. So this also just sketches the background of poverty, dysfunctional family, neighborhood violence, but just to see the impact that he was groomed, initiated, and how this had a ripple effect on other children within this community in the school. Then a 13-year-old, I think I'm just trying to illustrate how boys become prey to being victims of sexual abuse, who was receiving maths tuition by a female at his own home. And this female educator was, started sharing her marital problems with this 13-year-old, and of course started texting him, and then requested images of his genitalia. She shared hers. However, to cut this chase to the tail, the parents cottoned onto the messages, and this young boy was distraught. He became depressed. He refused to attend school, and he felt that he was deeply in love with this educator, and that he was responsible for her, that he was responsible for this relationship, that she had not initiated it. In fact, he felt that, it was his, he was the person to be blamed and not her. So, again, he was then referred for psychological intervention. It took a long time for the child to return to school. And of course, the educator was reported to SACE as she was a private tutor. Then I just want to bring in an adult academic that I worked with, quite a high-profile person from a very illustrious university, and had just recently got married and found that he could not relate to an intimate relationship. He was referred, we don't work with children, but because of somebody knowing the resource and the facility, referred him to the Teddy Bear Foundation. And he disclosed his sexual abuse as a child at a boarding school and his aversion to any sexual intimacy. And he said this occurred repeatedly through his childhood, and he never shared this with anybody. So this is just to illustrate how so many people suffer in silence and go through their lives painfully without receiving any kind of support, and the strong impact it leaves on people's lives and their relationships. Next slide, please. And I think this is what I want to just say, that we often, we're quick to address or attach labels: bad, mad, sad, boy, and actually misunderstanding the behavior, what they're crying out for help, their attempts to the solution of the problem. So we see hostility, aggression, doubts around their sexual identity, orientation, suddenly changing, wanting to change their mode of dressing, wanting to dress like a female, or, just emasculate, becoming very thin, not wanting to be attractive or obese. And I think these are things that we actually need to be more aware of before we resort to any kind of labels or diagnosis in the medical model. Next slide, please. So I think just reflecting on everything that I've said, and if we just look around us, that traditionally culture actually does not allow young boys to talk about sexual assault or being sexually abused. And we know that boys are afraid because they know that the blame is going to be shifted on them, and they would be accused of lying and made to feel guilty and responsible, that what happened to them is their fault. And I think the reality is that people out there are often unsympathetic to boys, more sympathetic to girls. And the kind of support we've seen in our work on the ground is families would rather ignore, deny it, and are less willing to support a boy that has been sexually abused. But we need to realize that boys are the forgotten group, and counseling can help boys cope with the powerful physical and emotional reactions to their experience, regaining that sense of power and control that they've lost, and leaving them in a total state of despair, helplessness, hopelessness, frustration, and feeling defenseless. Thank you.
Faisal, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, we're ready for the next presentation.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Suzanne. And thank you, Shahida, for the very interesting presentation. So good morning, everyone. I will talk to some findings from the State of South Africa's Fathers Report, and it's particularly in response to one of the findings of the Cindy report on the protective nature of social fatherhood. I will then at the end just present a few resources that might be useful as follow-up reference points. So the first, I think, important surprising thing to note is that it's surprising to some is that most children live with men. In fact, at the most recent General Household Survey, 78% of children lived with men. We, in the sector, we are very familiar with the low rate of co-residence of biological fathers. And I think that's often confused with the number of men that children actually live with. So we put this at the beginning of our report just to make it clear that most children actually live with men. About half of the men that they live with are their biological fathers, and another half are uncles, brothers, grandfathers, older siblings, etc. The second point to emphasize is that the State of South Africa's father report falls into a field of research that is emphasizing father involvement rather than co-residence only. We sometimes, again, might fall into the trap of thinking that co-residence means high involvement. In other words, if a biological father lives with a child, they might be very involved in a beneficial way. But there are also some fathers who do not live with their children who are quite involved. And on the other hand, there are, of course, many biological fathers who do live with children who are not involved at all in a beneficial, emotional way. I think if we talk about the establishment of masculinities and the social norms that adhere to particular forms of masculinity, the exposure to male role models is, of course, a really important aspect to bear in mind. So what we are trying to do with the research on fatherhood is to dig a bit deeper into what is going on in terms of men's interaction with children in the roles of caregivers. So this set of graphs over here comes from a set of questions that we asked in a survey where we sent out a mobile survey to 1,000 fathers in 2021. And it's a connected sample, so that can also give you a sense of the socioeconomic status of the respondents. It's fathers who had mobile phones. The first finding that I'd like to highlight is that there seems to be an encouraging intergenerational trend where most of the fathers, 54% and 46%, had been hit or beaten or slapped by their parents or caregivers. And in terms of their own self-reporting, this was much lower in terms of them using violence with their own children, often framed as corporal punishment, but basically hitting their own children. So that was one encouraging trend to see, is that the transfer was lower than we had expected. And then another finding that I think speaks to the difficulty of self-reporting of experiences of sexual violence is that many of the fathers reported very low accounts of having experienced or used sexual violence. 2%, in fact, on either having experienced or used violence. And I think especially the reporting of the experience of sexual violence, it does not match the numbers that we see from the Optimist report, which go up to, I think, 37% of boys having experienced sexual abuse in the ways that the Optimus study framed that. So I think it emphasizes also what Shahida was saying about the difficulty to understand the experience and to report the experience. Then on the, I think also on the encouraging side, and also speaking to the point about the protective nature of social fathers, where men take on the role of acting as a role model or caregiver to a child. What was really nice to see was from this sample how many men who are not biologically related to children were involved in children's lives in a diversity of ways. I've just highlighted here on the left-hand side, you can see the findings of self-reported behavior from fathers who are biologically related to their children. And on the right-hand side, it's men who are not biologically related to the child that they are caring for. And the numbers are quite high. It's of course higher for the biological fathers, but it's equally high, or not equally high, but it's almost as high for social fathers. And for example, the one item of talking to a child about a topic of interest to the child. And remember, this is fathers talking to the child. So not only giving money or protecting the child, but actually engaging with the child. This was actually higher for the fathers who are not related to the children that they are caring for. And this is a very encouraging finding, at least from this sample. Just a qualifier again to say that this is not a representative sample. It was only 1,000 fathers. We hope to get to a point where we do have a representative sample and actually ask mothers the same questions about father involvement. But nevertheless, from this sample, it was really, really interesting to see how involved men are who are not related to the children that they are caring for. So then I wanted to just share a few resources, and I'll put the links to these in the chat box, the link to the fatherhood report, but also the link to this report, which is a report that Sonke produced in partnership with Promundo, the End Violence Against Children Partnership, and Together for Girls. It is basically a review of the evidence for psychosocial interventions that respond to children exposed to trauma. So if we want to break the intergenerational cycle of violence, the one way to do it is, of course, to prevent the violence from happening in the first place. But as many of you on the call would know, if you have experienced violence, the likelihood that you might continue that violence is also quite high. So this is basically a collection of interventions, a review that was done globally that looks at which interventions show the best evidence for actually responding to trauma, but also reducing the likelihood that those who have experienced trauma will use violence. I was really interested in Shahida, in your point that those who experienced violence are actually not that likely to repeat it, and that those who are using sexual violence might not have necessarily experienced sexual violence. So that's also interesting to note. So I'm also saying this in the context of the point that you had made. Then I'd like to end by just sending all of you to this wonderful website. It's a website for a new campaign called the Global Boyhood Initiative. And it basically provides an evidence-based set of resources for encouraging boys to share emotions in healthy ways, to accept and connect with others, to speak out against bullying where possible, and also to break free from stereotypes. And I think this is a wonderful complement to the report that Cindy has shared, where we see how important it is to assist boys in building responsible versions of masculinities for that affirm their own identity, but also encourage them to become more connected to others, more empathetic, and less likely to use violence. One of the resources from this website, and it's free, it's online, is this set of conversation starters for children. And there's a pack of cards for each different age group from 4 to 13. And you can see there is an example of one of the cards from the deck. It helps caregivers or parents or counselors just to start a conversation with a boy. So here you would see a question like, what would you do if you were mad at a friend or family member? And how could you share your feelings and work towards a solution? So that's a brief glimpse into the findings from the State of South Africa's Fathers Report and some resources that I'm very happy to refer you to use in case you want to take up any of the reading or the actions. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Back to you.
Thanks, Wessel. And yeah, Nonhle from Childline South Africa will now share some of their work in her presentation. Over to you, Nonhle.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all for involving Childline in this important aspect. It's great conversations that we should really continue talking about, and especially touching on boys. Somehow, they are really hidden, as Dr. Shahida has stated earlier. We need to strengthen their level of visibility. And we believe that through the work we're all doing, we will strengthen what we see as existing gaps. Childline is a nonprofit organization. We are known to be working with children. Apologies for my voice. It's a scratchy because of the flu that I'm recovering from. Do inform me if you cannot hear me clearly. You can move to the next slide, Suzanne. And the next one as well. So basically, I thought it's important for me to share about the work that we have been doing in response to working with boys, looking at those who are victims of sexual violence, and how we were able to create this initiative as Childline. Childline, normally we can be somehow confused with other provincial offices because there's a slight difference. You can see that we are speaking of Childline South Africa. We are the national office. However, we also have affiliates who are our Childline provincial officers. We're all providing services for children. However, our presence as provincial officers plays a major role because they are always there to attend to cases that are affecting each province. Therefore, as Childline South Africa, we add on with the support that we're providing to ensure that we spread our services, especially to areas where we feel our provincial officers may have a struggle to reach. Therefore, with this initiative, Childline identified the National Association of Child and Youth Care Workers, which is called in abbreviations NACCW. And then we identified that NACCW had residential programs that they were implementing, especially with children in children's homes and also in schools. And we had to add on with our services of providing therapeutic interventions into the program, which was called Isibindi. So we then started working with them from 2013, and we adopted the Isibindi project. And then we focused on working with young children who were victims of sexual abuse and also those who presented with sexualized behavior. So in terms of us working as Childline, we rely mostly on funding. Therefore, we would have the opportunity to be supported by Global Fund funding, which somehow would also be filtered through into South Africa with principal recipients such as NACOSA or AFSA or Beyond Zero. Therefore, over the past years, we've been able to run this program, and then where we were lucky to actually reach 1,200 children in total. Next slide, please. A brief about the Child Protection Program. In terms of our partnerships, we saw that it's vital for us to involve various role players. Therefore, we were able to identify qualified social workers. We trained them on how to work with children. We trained them on play therapy with children as another form of communication and engagement. And then we then identified areas or facilities where we could have a school-based program during the school holidays. And then with NSCCW, they would assist us with providing us with the child and youth care workers who would also be present in the same facility. Therefore, we ended up coming with a name of this program. We called it the Residential Therapy Program. And it had to happen over a period of 7 days during school holidays. And we had divided it as a therapeutic residential program for victims from 17-year-olds downwards, and then also for children displaying with inappropriate, deviant, or offending behavior. So we were looking at the cycle of care child protection model, which was devised by the NSCCW, as I've mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So in terms of our residential program, what was happening, just to give an overview, we were guided by the Children's Act and also the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act of 2015. And then, as I said earlier, we were doing this program during the school holidays in order to ensure that we have even teachers, some of the teachers would volunteer to be present in our facility and observe the program and even support those children who perhaps did not have a caregiver who can accompany the child. So we would cover within the 7 days. We said this has to be a short and intensive therapeutic program, and we would have wished that maybe it could stretch a bit longer. So within that 7 days, we would really work hard with all the individuals, perhaps 20 to 30 children per program we would accommodate. So we would have individual therapy sessions, we would have also group sessions, and we would also engage individually with caregivers because we felt if they are the significant other, it's important for them to be aware and also to learn and unlearn certain ways of interacting and supporting their children and being aware about the abuse, especially when it comes to boys, because there are a lot of misconceptions about boys and responding to sexual abuse matters. And then we would also have an educational workshop and then get Department of Health to be present, whereby they can provide pre and post HIV counseling services for those who feel at ease and confident about taking their services. We will then also like to follow up and ensure that we follow up on the parents, we follow up on the children and the teachers who are present, and also see how they went back home and how are they coping, and also link them up to layer on the services, link them up with Department of Social Development or with South African Police Services, where during the risk assessment, we could have identified certain gaps or welfare related needs. Next slide, please. So with the goal for this residential program, we wanted to really ensure that we start the healing process for the children with the support of their caregivers who are present, and have that psychosocial adjustment promoted within the participants and their caregivers, and to promote that level of emotional stability. We wanted to also reintegrate the sexual abuse experience into their lives because they tend to block and not talk about the experience itself and how it has affected them, and perhaps to even identify within themselves that as much as I've went through this experience and it was a horrible dream that I don't wish to go back to, it's important for us to engage with these boys and then help them to identify through how did you, being alone in that situation, ended up being able or gain that level of strength to do something to remove yourself from that situation or save yourself, because there would be that positive act that took place that the specific child may have not really paid much attention to, you know. So with that as well, it's where it seems off to say, I'm not really helpless. I was able to act and save myself from that instant. And we're starting this healing process right there and there as we have these conversations. And we also talk about family life, how we can identify if there's a healthy family relationship at home, and then what can be done to sort of improve the interaction that is taking place between the specific significant other and the child, and how can we strengthen the support that a specific parent can give to a child. Sometimes when you have faced a very difficult or traumatic or scary situation, as an adult, you become fearful, you become emotionally helpless, you think a lot, and you withdraw from the actual environment, you withdraw from people who are existing within you. So for a child as well, we had to engage with caregivers and then show them that they also drawn into withdrawing and also go through a certain level of stress. They also become these vulnerable little beings who wish they could have someone who can say everything will be okay. So we help them. What is your safe space that you feel when you are there, you are somehow comfortable and happy? How would you like your aunt or your grandma to perhaps treat you? You know, what would make you happy? So at times we also encourage caregivers to listen to the children when they talk, because they know what they also want and feel. And we need to help them also understand that when you're feeling this way, it means you are not okay and you must talk it out. So this is the goals that we strive to achieve during that 7-day period. As short as it sounds, we lay the foundation as well. We also promote body integrity as well, and then try to build their self-esteem and strength. We facilitate disclosures, because at times you'll find that a child is referred to the program only because they had identified assumptions of some physical abuse, and also assumptions of behavioral problems that perhaps a teacher saw as very concerning. So when we engage with children, we then identify that this boy had experienced some level of sexual abuse, and it was difficult for him to voice it out. And as now they're seeing that this particular person is present with me, I am now able to actually state what happened to me. So we use different mediums to communicate. We use pictures, we use stories. They can even imitate and say, with this particular story, we feel that I was the same as this particular character, and I do remember that this happened as well. So we also allow them to draw and play. So from there, we really learn a lot about how do children communicate. And when I say children, both girls and boys, we have seen them that they respond when you are there lending that hand to actually assist them and help them through. So we also see what can you learn as a way of coping. So when you're feeling that you are scared and cannot really pass this test, you then wonder what could help you. You know, they will give you an example that I'm thinking of, also trying to skip watching TV and then maybe study more, you know. So we work from there and say, then when you're feeling unsafe, what do you think will actually make you feel a bit more safer? Then maybe I can go with a friend, or I can ask my mom to accompany me to school, or so forth and so forth. So those conversations, they lead us into seeing what other ways can we generate with the children when we talk to them. So those were actually our goals. And also we see and pick up a lot of societal issues as well with the caregivers. Next slide, please. So in terms of the interaction that we have with children, as much as this presentation talks about the programs that we had been implementing, I would like to also add on that we continue planting our services as Childline in Tutuzela care centers and crisis centers in different provinces, even though still our availability and visibility depends highly on funding, but we say it's open to all ages and it's open to both girls and boys, but still we are seeing a less number of cases of boys reporting sexual abuse cases. There will be very few. Out of 30 cases, you'll find that for male or boys, it would be 3 or 2 cases. And they were also identified because there was a particular matter that was reported, and we saw that there's also an indication of sexual abuse matters involved. So with us engaging with boys, we found out that for them, it's not easy to talk. It's not easy for them to picture themselves as vulnerable human beings who can be abused and can be perceived as human beings who are harmed as well. They see themselves as individuals who are supposed to have power to act against any perpetrator, whether it's a female perpetrator or a male perpetrator. And especially if it's a female, they are really not at ease at talking about this. There's also that level of lack of awareness and knowledge about where they can seek help. They are aware that they must report to the police, but with certain experiences, sometimes they do not want to just jump into opening a case. However, they need that level of emotional and psychosocial help. So they would not know which door to go to. And this brings us back to how are we creating demand for the boys as well to access our services and to feel welcome to reach out to our services. So I also applaud the initiative that is taken by Sonke Foundation, and thank you, Russell, for that presentation. It's really interesting. We also saw that they were very much appreciative of the opportunity to interact with different professionals during our programs, and also to interact with other boys who reported that I have gone through the same experience or had a similar experience as well. So they would see and relate to each other, and then they will then feel at ease to talk it out. We also noted that there are those values from the community or from home, and you know, those perceptions about being masculine. They tend to then use that to define themselves as who they are, and then they become trapped in that and do not really get the chance to express and deal and face their past experiences of trauma. So we really encourage such discussions and conversations to continue so that we see where else can we tackle or find ways of dealing with these matters, and actually encourage boys and young men to come out and also talk and be encouraged to support the initiatives that are of existence and not have that feeling or need to hide, because at the end of the day, trauma exists, and the psychosocial services that are there can really be beneficial to our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Nonhle, for that presentation on your programs that you're running through Childline. I'm going to hand over now to Linda Smallbones to wrap up the presentations, and then we will move into the question and answers. I see people are pasting in the chat, so please do continue. We will come back to those after this next presentation.
Thanks, Susie, and everybody. We've been listening for about an hour, so if you need a bit of a stretch and take a deep breath, I'll try not to go over 10 minutes, and then you can move on to some questions. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for being here. So I remember being a social worker in the field and doing home visits, and being asked on more than one occasion to please talk to the young adolescent child in the home who was rebelling. So more often than not, it would be a boy child, and more often than not, around 13 years of age, they would maybe be just entering a rebellious phase, starting to smoke or drink, not coming home, being non-cooperative. There was this assumption that if I, as the social worker, spoke to the child, I would carry some type of weight or authority that would make the child change their ways. If I gave a lecture and spoke to them harshly, maybe they would start behaving again. I will come back to why this approach didn't work. So a child who's experienced sexual violence may be feeling, among other things, completely uncontained, unsafe, and enraged. Boys often respond to stress and trauma through acting out, externalizing behaviors. So you may see an increased level of aggression, rough play, bullying, hitting, and conduct issues. There may be non-cooperation in the classroom and at home, where behavior is generally controlled through punishment and harsh discipline in order to get the desired good behavior. So harsh discipline is the use of verbal communication as well as physical punishment that tends to lecture, humiliate, deride, and criticize. And it can include shouting, swearing, name-calling, and hitting. And many people are under the assumption that the stricter the punishment and the more punitive the parenting, the better behaved the child. But this is simply not true. It can help to control the behavior temporarily, but doesn't help the child learn skills of self-regulation in the long term, and doesn't actually help the child know how to deal with their overwhelming feelings along the way. So if a boy child in particular, if his behavior is his bad behavior, quote unquote, is an adaptation to frightening traumatic experiences, punishment and harsh discipline reinforces a sense of shame and teaches the child his feelings and responses are wrong, that he is somehow wrong and bad. And this can simply perpetuate a negative behavior response. So what is the alternative? Next slide, please, Suzanne. Responsive caregiving is a core component of the nurturing care framework. Responsive caregiving is about observing and responding to your child in order to recognize and then meet their needs. Responsive caregiving is relational in nature. It is needed to develop all children all the way through to adulthood. Positive discipline is part of a responsive caregiving approach and relationship with the child. This next slide, please, Susie. So positive discipline is a relational way of disciplining your child that promotes connection rather than punishment. When a child feels connected to you, they feel safe with you, and they are more likely to follow you. The more connected they are, the more they feel understood, the more likely they are to cooperate with you and to share with you what is actually happening in their lives, including when they've experienced abuse. And at the heart of positive discipline is empathy, seeking to understand the child from the child's point of view. It's the question, what happened, rather than what did you do? Parents who have never experienced empathy or haven't been taught about it will see their children's emotions, even in response to trauma, as inconvenient or an overreaction. And I wanted to specifically get to us as practitioners and what we could do in light of boys and sexual violence. So Susie, if you could move to the next slide. We work in exceptionally difficult circumstances. It's sometimes hard to know what to say or do in spite of our training. Sometimes it feels like a strong lecture and a force of authority are what is needed, or they become the only tools that we have because we haven't found another way. But I'm proposing that there is another way, another set of ways of being and practicing that move the child and family towards healing. One way is that a trauma-informed approach is needed, especially with families who've experienced sexual violence, whether the child in the family is the actor or the victim of the sexual violence. a trauma-informed approach supports positive discipline, as both are founded on principles of empathy and relational connection. So be trauma-informed. To be trauma-informed is to work with an understanding of what psychological and emotional trauma is, and to be aware of the far-reaching impact on the holistic well-being and development of the child and family. So Duras and Crowley define trauma as what happens to a person when there is either too much too soon, too much for too long, or not enough for too long. And we could spend a whole session just unpacking that definition. But trauma could be an event that is horrific and overwhelming, such as a car accident with fatalities, or it could also be an ongoing set of circumstances which constantly interrupt connection between people. For example, in situations of ongoing domestic violence or sexual abuse, those situations that are characterized by violence, fear, and secrecy in the family. The opportunities for safe, positive, consistent connection between parents and children become really limited in those situations. To be trauma-informed is to understand the systemic impact of trauma and its potentially long-lasting effect if support and care are not made available. And again, trauma interrupts connection. And I liked what Nontle said about in their program, the importance of engaging with caregivers, and it speaks to this very point. Every single human being is born with a deep need for relationships built on belonging, love, and safety. Trauma comes and interrupts these connections or does further damage to them if those relationships are already in crisis. To be trauma-informed is to understand how healing can occur through building safe, consistent, connected relationships. And this is where we as practitioners can support and assist parents. Once there is safety, there can be connection with others. And then healing can start at some point after that. So in situations where there has been sexual violence, you may be dealing with a traumatized system, the entire family, especially, and that is exacerbated when you live in a violence-affected community. Trauma causes people to retreat into fear, into fight or flight mode, or they freeze and shut down completely. So parents can get into the situation that Nontle was referring to, that they're too busy self-protecting, they're too busy surviving to reach out in connection with others, even their own children. So we need to understand that the behaviors of the child and even the parents could be driven by recent trauma or unresolved trauma from the past. Consider the community context of the families that you're currently working in. What is happening there right now? What has been happening in this community in recent months or years? And when you become trauma-informed, you can help parents to become trauma-informed as well. What you can teach parents about trauma and the impact of trauma can help them to understand their son's adaptive behavior, which then can help them to be more understanding and empathic and hopefully less punitive. Just one resource which I'll put into the comments is the Trauma Centre in Cape Town offer training and trauma support and various resources that you can access online, and I will put that in the comments. Then to move on to the next slide, please, Susie, just for us to check our own mindsets as practitioners. What are our mindsets, our assumptions, our prejudices against boys in general? And specifically boys affected by sexual violence in particular, especially where they have been accused of causing harm to others. We also need to check our own mindsets and assumptions and prejudice against fathers. Don't assume fathers' intentions or lack of them. Work towards understanding the father's role in the family and the father's will to be involved, and work with that wherever you can. Let them know that their relationship with their sons and their daughters are important, and they are important. And then we need to, as practitioners, check our own mindsets about discipline. What style of discipline do we come from? And if you'd like to learn more about positive discipline and practical ways to use it, the SAPN network are a national network whose member organizations all train communities and practitioners in their parenting programs, and they all come apart from a positive discipline point of view. So I will also put that link into the comments. Then practice empathy and compassion towards caregivers in order to build relationship and to model what you want to see in the relationship between the caregiver and child. Inspire confidence in the caregiver, in mothers and in fathers. From the research, many female caregivers, especially single mothers, feel inadequate to parent boy children. So the practitioner really needs to work on inspiring confidence in the caregiver that she was chosen to be this child's mother, that she has a bond with him, and that he very much needs her in his life. And the same goes for fathers. Group contexts for learning about positive discipline may be more effective for practitioners and caregivers. The group is potentially a powerful place of connection and support for people who've been through the same situation. It is also the place where the group can generate their own solutions and alternatives to harsh discipline, thus taking the pressure off the practitioner to have all the answers, and allows for group learning and an increase in a sense of agency. Then finally, practitioners' own support and supervision in this process is critical and key. Like I started with, our jobs are hard, our work is hard. Be intentional about talking through your own thought patterns and mindsets, especially in relation to sexual violence, and work on dealing with them. Healing from sexual trauma for boys and their families is complex and multi-layered. There is no quick or easy fix. Strengthening parents to be more responsive in their parenting and practice positive discipline is possible. So the story at the beginning where I had to lecture the child, a lecture to a child won't change anything. Teaching parents how to build safe, empathic relationships with their children can change a whole lot. Thank you so much. I do have another 2 slides that will be sent out that are messages. I'm not going to speak to them, messages that you could give parents. These are just key messages. And then also some reflection questions that you can ask for yourself, of yourself in your practice, but that also you can ask of caregivers to stimulate conversation and reflection and hopefully ultimately healing. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to all the other panelists for their excellent presentations. We now are entering into a session of question and answers. So I'm going to scroll through the chat, but if anybody would like to go ahead and ask a question to one of the panelists now, please do feel free to unmute yourselves. You should be able to just directly unmute yourself and just note who you're directing the question to, or if it's just a general question to the panel. Yeah, so please go ahead if anybody would like to start.
Okay.
Go ahead, Yumna. Is anybody brave enough to start the questions? Otherwise, I shall just scroll through here. Okay, we had a question from somebody in northern Nigeria. It just identifies you as iPhone user. And the question here is, what they've understood during the course of the running of this project is that some of these children don't even know they are being abused. In other words, they haven't been equipped with the necessary knowledge to help them recognize abuse, as well as to talk about it. And this was definitely something that was highlighted in our research, that what constitutes sexual abuse, and particularly looking at grooming behaviors or non-contact sexual abuse, was not very well understood in the general population. So I don't know if one of our panelists wants to talk to that a little bit more, and what more could be done to strengthen that, particularly within families.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
My name is Salamatu, and I'm a human rights activist and as well as gender-based violence activist. So I took in, at my free time, I try to educate children, young boys, young girls on what an abuse is, how to recognize abuse. And then each time any child come forward to tell me, oh, excuse me, I am being touched by my uncle, I am being touched by my aunt, I am being touched by my teacher or by my neighbor, you realize that there's a gap, there's a missing gap. These children don't what is being done to them is not right. That is when the comment means one thing a predator will do first is brainwash a child into believing what they're doing to them is right. I grew up with my parents, but we believe in hitting children and all that. There are some casual mistakes I have done as a child that all they needed was just say to me. But African parents, violence, hitting and hitting and hitting. At a point, well, I could commit any crime. All I know is they're just going to hit me a little, and that's all. Educating these children. Hello?
Salma, your connection is not great, but I think your question is around the use of harsh discipline and how this silences children. Okay, maybe I'm going to hand that question over to Linda just to talk a little bit more about it. I think she did cover some of it in her presentation.
Yes. So what I didn't get to kind of talk to specifically is that, harsh discipline and hitting, people think it's effective, but it's about a control that is exerted by the parent from the outside. So it's a very top-down approach, and it's unhelpful in that it does not help the child to learn through their development, to give them internal motivations to behave in line with parents or societies or their own expectations of themselves. So it's very from the outside in. So it's questionable what they learn about internal motivations. And then also, when things are from the outside in, it doesn't encourage critical thinking for the child about their actions, or encourage taking responsibility then for their own actions. So if I heard you right, Salma, that you were saying, so you broke up a little bit, so I'm not sure I heard correctly, but you were saying you'd get hit for things, but that was it. There was never maybe any discussion. It was just hit and move on, kind of. So I'm not sure if I heard you correctly there, but in that case, like, is there any learning from that situation other than to learn to fear, to behave out of fear? So a true understanding of what is healthy and helpful for me and healthy and helpful for other people is not being taught through the harsh discipline process. And as I say, like, that empathy is not being developed. So I don't know if anybody else had anything to add on that, but that, from my understanding of the question. Thanks,
Linda. Salma, I hope that answers some of your question. I'm going to move on to the next one, which is from, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. I apologize if I don't, but Upasna. And you were asking about were children with disabilities included as part of the research and surveys, and children with disabilities are extremely vulnerable, even often targeted for abuse and yet overlooked in studies. Yes, you're absolutely correct. This is a highly vulnerable group, and we didn't directly target children with disabilities through the research that we did. In fact, we did it in conjunction with Childline, so it was children that came through their therapeutic intervention program. Obviously, the topic is already highly sensitive, and we didn't want to secondary traumatize any children, so we wanted to make sure we did that through a recognized already existing program. But maybe Nonhle or Shahida, you could talk a little bit about the issue of children with disabilities and their vulnerability to sexual abuse through your programs, and if you have anything specifically to address these children.
Thanks, Suzanne. You got my name perfectly right.
Good.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I think that the challenge for everybody, even us as practitioners working with victims of sexual abuse, the population, the most marginalized group are children with disabilities. And the reality is that we actually do see a lot of children with disabilities with conclusive medical findings at the medical clinic, but unfortunately, the children are not in a position to give a clear and coherent disclosure. We've seen children, who come forward with cerebral palsy, where we see that there is no intact hymen, there's been chronic penetration or chronic anal penetration, and these children are not able to identify. Children with speech impediments, speech defects. We saw a young girl who had actually never been to school and had limited communication, and only her mother was the person that could actually understand and relay what this young girl would actually express. So these are challenges, because as much as we try and extract information, use specialists, use people for signing, use people that work with autistic children, we are still struggling because the tools that we have on hand are not sufficient, and we are not equipped to reach out to those children. And of course, they continue to be vulnerable and continue to be at high risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahida. Just to add on, in terms of working with children with disabilities, we do receive cases at the facilities, hospital facilities, the Tutuzela care centers where we are stationed at. However, with reference to the program that I was presenting about, it was a challenge for us to include children with disabilities because they would also have requirements that would be above our ability to accommodate in terms of taking them away from home for a period of 7 days and having perhaps one caregiver from home to accompany them, because at most stages you would find that the venues we were using, there were guest houses, perhaps in game reserve areas, which were far from the urban areas where we could be able to quickly respond to ad hoc emergencies, even though we would identify that there is a hospital nearby. So we would not really include children with disabilities in our program due to the structure of it. However, such cases in hospital settings where we are based, we surely work closely with psychologists because we are not, unfortunately, we're not equipped to communicate further and engage with children with speech difficulties or severe mental disabilities. So it was quite a challenge for us to engage with them in such a program. Thank you.
Thanks, Nonhle. I see Shahida's raised her hand again. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Suzanne. So something that I want to bring to everybody's attention, I think that as practitioners, we find ways and means trying to be innovative in our working with children who have been victimized, and particularly your disadvantaged populations and children with disabilities. However, I think this is a bigger problem because something that Nonhle said just alerted me to the fact that when children have to go to court, when a criminal case is open and they have to testify, of course, are they competent to testify? The criteria that is required is actually not always fair and sound and just, because they would be expected to identify or be able to identify or distinguish between a truth and a lie, between different colors, identifying objects in the environment. But the reality is that some children have not reached that level of stimulation or have not been exposed to academic opportunities. So once again, I think this is a bigger problem than we realize, and we need to be aware of that because the courts are not empathic about that. Law enforcement, they only look at what is black and white. They do not look at shades of gray. Thank you.
Yeah, clearly lots more work to be done in that area. There's another question from Nompumelelo asking if there's a platform where social workers, social auxiliary workers, child and youth care workers consistently have an opportunity to engage with one another on the session topic. Nompumelelo, I don't know how you signed up for this webinar, but if you went through the Changemakers platform, that platform has been set up by Family for Every Child with exactly that purpose. And the great thing about it is that you actually have the opportunity to engage with practitioners from across the globe. So it includes members from all the 41 countries or 41 member organizations in the Family for Every Child Global Alliance, as well as a wider network called the RISE Learning Network, which is looking at the reintegration of sexually exploited children, but it covers sexual violence is included in that. So I would really encourage you to sign up to that and to participate there. You can post topics and events and have discussions, ask questions, engage with people and practitioners from all across the globe. And then in terms of sharing, Nicole Paulson asked if we're going to be sharing. Yes, if you signed up for this via the Changemakers platform, there will be a notice going around afterwards with the links to this recording and also the presentation and a copy of the research that Cindy produced with Childline. I think there were some more questions further down now. Oh, Felipe is just reminding to everybody to select the RISE Learning Network when you join. And then a Vessel's asking me a question. Wait, hang on. I thought I was the moderator, but yes, I can answer that. So it's Vessel, do you want to go ahead and ask in person? It's always nice to hear someone else's voice. No. It says, did your report have any documentation on who the perpetrators of sexual violence against boys were most likely to be from the report sample? We didn't ask that question directly, so we didn't ask specifically about people's personal experience. But in the literature review chapter at the beginning, there is some content around that. And actually what it was showing quite strongly is that it can be men and women, and that boys report that often. It's often also girls who are their peers, so not just older women, but sometimes girls who are their peers. There was a lot of stuff Kathy Ward has done around that. And yeah, so that would also be interesting to look at. If you haven't read the research report, the link will be shared, and please do have a look at that. Thanks, any other questions? I'm just running up through to see if I can find any more. Okay, somebody's just identified a Zoom user, says this is an interesting point. This is referring to you, Shahida. This topic must be slotted in under GBV, and we cannot discriminate against victims based on gender. And what age can boys impregnate a girl? Note for parental responsibility and rights, will this be taken up with the National Department of Social Development? Shahida, I'm going to let you talk a little bit. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about your involvement in the steering committee.
Thank you, Suzanne. So yes, I sit on the, well, I started initially on the Interim National Strategic Plan Steering Committee, and there are 6 pillars, as most of you are aware of, and I'm involved in pillar 2, which is prevention, and pillar 4, care, response and support. And in pillar 4, the work we're doing is looking specifically at sexual reproductive health and rights. So this is a very key in terms of prevention, but also responding and bodily autonomy. So it falls under gender-based violence. A lot of the dialogues, community dialogues, crime prevention dialogues, safe programs, outreach at schools is actually addressing this, and also looking at when does normal become abnormal, and looking specifically at rights and responsibilities, children's rights, and also access to resources and awareness of what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. Because I think early on a question was raised around that children don't always know that it's inappropriate, unacceptable and unlawful. And that is a true stark reality that very often they don't realize, sometimes very much later in life. So looking at the gender-based violence, I think this is a national approach reaching out to provinces across the country, and a lot of work we are partnering with UNICEF, so we're doing work specifically on GBV, SRHR and bodily autonomy in the Eastern Cape and Utukela in KZN. But in Gauteng, we are reaching out to communities, informal settlements and school settings where we can work with children. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Shahida. Do we have any other questions? We're approaching the end. Oh, here we've just had one more posted. If a boy is under 18, doesn't it fall under the Children's Act and gender-based violence address victims above the age of 19 and older? Just a clarification, Shahida, maybe you can respond to that.
Yes, so if a child is acting out sexually, I think we also need to be aware of the Children's Act is relevant, but we also need to take into consideration the Child Justice Act, and the age of criminal capacity is 12 years. So a child 12 and younger cannot be held criminally liable. And we also need to appreciate that the objectives of the Children's Act is looking at the best interest of the child, and the Child Justice Act is trying to keep children out of the criminal justice system, giving them a second opportunity in life for intervention, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Thank you.
Thanks, Shahida. I hope that clarified that for you, Dudley. Maybe just to explain, the reason in our research we call it sexual violence is that we were looking at both boys who are actors in inappropriate sexual behavior, but also boys who are victims. And I think it's really important, particularly when looking at this issue in relation to boys, that we understand how those two interplay and how our responses need to be stronger in terms of making sure that we're not labeling boys as perpetrators, but also supporting inappropriate sexual behaviors as a therapeutic need in children. So unless we have any other comments or questions, I think we have reached the end. Yeah, we're 1 minute over. So just in closing, I would like to say thank you so much again to our panelists, really great discussions. If you have any follow-up questions, I think most of you have my email address. Please do send me emails and I can direct them and forward them to the appropriate people, or join the Changemakers platform and you can also post your questions there. I definitely am a member there already, so we'll be able to see those and pass them on. And then also, I just wanted to say that the 16th of April is Blue Umbrella Day, which is a day that has been set up by Family for Every Child and their members to recognize and support boys affected by sexual violence. And this week we started on the 16th and we'll be ending on the 23rd, Saturday. We are running a social media campaign. So please do look up Cindy and the Teddy Bear Clinic and Childline South Africa. Give a Child a Family, I know, is also participating, and a number of other organizations. Please do look that up on social media. You can follow the hashtag Blue Umbrella Day and like and share. We're really trying to raise awareness around this very, very important topic. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, we hope to be hosting more events and work around this area in the future.